We are back with another Houndoom rogue deck, this time of a very different playstyle. This time around, Houndoom is a dark type, 70 HP stage 1. For 2 colorless, you deal 10 damage, flip a coin, if heads you do 20 more damage. It's not a great attack, but you also have to remember that you're most likely going to have a dark energy attached, so at minimum you're dealing 20 damage. The real beef of this card is coming from Lonely Fang, and this is the entire point of the deck. For 1 darkness energy and 2 colorless, Lonely Fang's going to deal 30 damage, plus 20 damage times the number of your opponent's bench Pokemon, minus the number of bench Pokemon that you have. That's kind of confusing. Basically, you just calculate the difference between the number of Pokemon on your bench and the number of Pokemon on your opponent's bench. However many more Pokemon they have than you, you're going to deal 20 times that amount added onto the 30 base damage for Lonely Fang. So if your opponent has a full bench of 5 Pokemon and you have 0 Pokemon on your bench, if Houndoom is in the active position, it's attacking alone, no backup, then you're going to be dealing 130 base damage plus 10 more damage for every darkness energy attached to Houndoom. That is a lot of damage for 3 energy and pretty limited setup, since you really just want to have 1 Houndoom in play and potentially 1 other Pokemon on your bench, just in case that Houndoom gets knocked out. You don't want to lose the game. And it's alright to have a benched Pokemon. You're not looking to get maximum damage every turn off of Lonely Fang. That's just not realistic. Instead, you're wanting to hit around that 70-80 range, and that's pretty easy to pull off considering this is a format where support Pokemon are heavily relied upon. Most decks in this format are going to have at least 3 or 4 Pokemon on the bench, and in a lot of cases, a full bench of 5. This is just such an interesting attack that I had to build a rogue deck around it. I had to do it. With the entire point of this deck to have Houndoom as a lonely little pupper in the active position, barely any support on the bench, what do you really do with the rest of the deck? What are those other 52 cards? Let's go ahead and get into it. Let's jump into the deck list! There are plenty of Hound Hours to choose from in E-Card. I really just like the 50 HP Dark type, especially for this deck. Your first turn attack, and you can just drop a Darkness Energy onto this thing and deal 20 damage for 1 energy. That's not bad. The resistance to Psychic is pretty nice in several matchups, and the weakness to Fighting doesn't really come up that often. I mean, the only fighting cards that are really used in E-Card are Machamp and Donphan, and even then you don't see them a lot. Of course, we are running a full playset of both Houndour and Houndoom just because it's vitally important to get it into play as quickly as possible. Start stacking energies on there. This is meant to be a relatively speedy deck. You're going to be using Lonely Fang minimum on turn 3. So for E-Card, that's as speedy as you can get, really. Not a whole lot of big attackers are going to be firing off before turn 3 anyway. And to help you get there, there is going to be some support in this deck. We're going to run a 2-2 line of Furret, just because Furret's Scavenger Hunt ability is going to let you dig through your deck and get out one of those special darkness energies that you need to get off a Lonely Fang. But here's the thing about your support Pokemon, you don't always have to play them. Just because you have them in your hand doesn't mean you need to put them on your bench. If you're needing to maximize your damage output with Lonely Fang, then maybe you don't need to play a Furret. Maybe you started the game with 2 darkness energy in hand. Speaking of, we've got 2 water type Staryu and 2 psychic type Starmie. These are basically in here for alternative attackers and type coverage. Just because they're in the deck doesn't mean you have to play them. They're very situational. If you're in a matchup where you don't need to hit for water weakness or psychic weakness, then you may not even need to play these stars onto the bench. Although Starmie's star back attack is pretty useful, especially if you need to charge up a fresh Houndoom that's on the bench. You know, you are going to get situations where you start the game with a Staryu and you go, well, yeah, I might as well just start out attacking with Starmie instead. And just to make sure that you are getting the Hound Hours and Houndooms that you need, full playset of Pokemon Fan Club and full playset of Professor Elm's Training Method. Again, you have to be very choosy. Just because you have it in your hand doesn't mean that you have to use it. Usually, you know, you use a Pokemon Fan Club on your first or second turn and then you never think about them again. The 4 copies are in there just so you can get them early enough. It's more of a ratio thing. You want to make sure that you're drawing some type of search or at least some big draw support early game, That's why they're featured so heavily. It's not that you're actually going to be using 3 Professor Oak's research every game, but you do want to have enough draw power featured in the deck that you're going to get it on turns that you really need it. Because there's probably going to be a lot of mulligans, you know, there's only 8 basic Pokemon in this deck. Copycat's going to be pretty useful in increasing your hand size to match whatever your opponent's bloated hand size has become, depending on how many mulligans you actually took, and that's going to be helpful for getting a Furret into play. So not only are you going to be able to draw into a Furret, but you're going to have extra cards to discard off of it in order to get the special Darkness Energy out of your deck. Those Darkness Energies are pretty vital, so there's a full playset of Power Charge in here, just so you have a way to recycle those. You're typically not going to be attaching more than 1 special Dark to a Houndoom unless you really have to, unless you really just need that extra 10 damage to get an OHKO or finish a Pokemon off. Houndoom itself is kind of fragile with only 70 HP, so there's also a full playset of Potion in here. Whenever I have the room for it, I always put in a full playset of Potion into these rogue decks just to make it a lot harder to knock out the star Pokemon. Most of the archetypes you're going to be up against are these big stage 2 Pokemon that have 100 HP or 120, so you need some extra tools to be able to compete. These archetypes are also really heavy on high energy cost attacks, so full playset of energy removal too, because we can fit it in. We've got the room for it. We might as well add in that extra layer of disruption by going, yeah, I know that you've got a huge attack on your side of the field too, but I'm not going to let you use it. And what you're probably going to find in playing this deck is that Lonely Fang will change the way your opponent stacks their side of the field. They're not going to be adding a bunch of unnecessary support Pokemon. They're not going to be trying to set up multiple attackers on the bench when you've got this attack that is going to get more powerful based on how many Pokemon they play down. Instead, their focus is probably going to shift to, well, I'm going to have 1 backup attacker and I'm just going to load energy onto that 1 dude so that when my active gets Lonely Fanged and gets knocked out, I've got this backup that can come right in, knock out that Houndoom, and basically win me the game. Well, your job is to stop them from doing that with energy removals and by attaching Cyclone Energy, which is going to gust out one of those few Pokemon on your opponent's bench that they've been building up. They've been limiting their bench so that they're not powering up Lonely Fang, but you go, okay, well, if you're only going to have 1 Pokemon on your bench, well, I'm going to gust it out. You don't have a choice, and I'm just still going to knock it out with a Lonely Fang before you can fully power it up. A lot of mental math has to go on in order to run Lonely Fang Houndoom. You're doing all of these damage calculations and figuring out, how do I reach this specific amount of damage for the KO based on my bench as opposed to my opponent's bench? Let's go back to Starmie, because I kind of glossed over earlier, and why I included it in this build. For 1, it's just a good alternative attacker for any deck. For 1 energy, it's a pretty good counter against your opponent's big energy cost Pokemon. You can deal a decent chunk of damage for only 1 Psychic. Up against an attacking Machamp, which requires 4 energy in order for it to attack, then Energy Burst is going to be dealing 100 damage for only 1 energy. If you want to go for the KO, you can just attach another energy to Starmie and deal 120 damage for the OHKO. That is off of a coin flip though, so it's not super reliable. What I like most about this Starmie though is Starback, because 40 damage for 3 energy is pretty okay, but you're also able to attach a basic energy card from your discard pile to one of your Pokemon. So like I said earlier, if you don't have another Houndoom fresh on your bench powered up for a Lonely Fang, then you can move a Starmie into the active position, hopefully it's powered up by this point, and accelerate a basic energy onto the bench. This seems like a big ask to just have 3 energy on a backup Starmie during a game where you're already investing 3 energy into a Houndoom, but remember, E-card moves a little bit slower, you've got those extra turns, and in the case of this build, if you have a Starmie on the bench, it's probably the only Pokemon that you have on your bench until it moves into the active position, and then that's when you're going to start playing whatever else you need for your next steps. But feel free to let me know down in the comments what you think another good partner would be for Houndoom for situations where you do need a little bit of bench support. I was so close to uploading my build of this deck that had Skyridge Murkrow instead, just because Evil Eye and Blindside both help you not only set up for Lonely Fang OHKOs a little later in the game, but they also help clean up some missed OHKOs. So if your opponent's Pokemon has 100 HP and you only deal 90 damage, well, you can jump this Murkrow into play, and for 1 Darkness Energy, Evil Eye for the prize card. The only reason that this Murkrow did not make the cut as, a great partner was that it's weak to fighting. The 2 Murkrow printed previous to this one had no weakness, but the way the TCG assigns weaknesses is quite a bit different from the in-game way it works sometimes. And look, this Murkrow is still a really good fit for a Lonely Fang deck. I just didn't like running a build that was 100% weak to fighting. That was almost an auto loss against Donphan. Lonely Fang is just one of those strategies where I think the matchups depend heavily on your skill level versus your opponent's skill level, and how you know how to pilot this deck versus your opponent's ability to play against this deck. As I was talking about earlier, adjusting their own bench space to depower Lonely Fang as much as possible, while also not setting themselves up for instant failure if you gust out their bench support and obliterate it with a Lonely Fang. A high-powered Lonely Fang is super easy to set up against an opponent that just plays down 5 Pokemon onto their bench on turn 2, but once you play Houndoom and your opponent picks it up off the table to read what Lonely Fang does, it's how you adapt from that point forward. Thank you very much for watching till the end. As always, I want to hear your thoughts down in the comments. What do you think about this deck? What do you think about the various Houndooms available in eCard, and how would you rank them? We're getting close to the bottom of the eCard deck list. I only have a few more to upload, so let me know if there's any cards you were expecting to see that haven't popped up, or any personal favorite archetypes that I've just completely overlooked. Social media links down in the description. Have a great day. I'll see you next video.